The night was never silent on Vera 9, a planet drenched in ash and broken monuments. Long before I ever set foot there, the whispers spoke of a curse, that when the wind fell still, the screams of one girl could rattle the bones of the long dead, pulling them back into unholy motion. I thought it was just a story to keep explorers away, another Death World rumor meant to scare children. But the first time I heard her voice split the darkness and saw the ground tremble with skeletal hands clawing free, I realized some stories are warnings, not fables. I was Elias Kale, human mercenary, and I had stumbled into something beyond wars and weapons, into a destiny tied to a girl whose breath carried resurrection. I met her in ruins, her figure pale against shattered stone, towers, her eyes burning with terror and shame. The moment her screams slipped free, the world obeyed, and the earth fractured open beneath our boots. Corpses, half-rotted and bone-white, lurched upward like broken marionettes. She fell to her knees as if her lungs had betrayed her, as if she hated herself for what she could not control. I pulled her up by the wrist, firing my rifle into the rising dead, and shouted at her to move. Her name, I would later learn, was Solara, a name her people whispered only with fear, because they believed her cursed by their gods. But that night, to me, she was not a curse. She was a girl who needed someone not to run. As we sprinted through the debris fields, she tried to warn me, her voice trembling in half sobs, half words. She told me that everyone who stayed near her ended up in graves, and those graves never stayed shut. Her words cut like jagged glass, but I held my silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence was power. When the corpses rose, at her scream it was only when I hushed her, placing a hand gently across her lips, that the chaos slowed. For reasons neither of us understood then, my silence muted her curse, as if my presence bent the rules of her power. That was when I knew. She didn't need chains. She didn't need exile. She needed an anchor. We found refuge in a collapsed temple, the roof shattered, vines crawling down broken columns. The night outside pulsed with the shambling dead, their joints snapping and echoing like drums of war. Solara curled into herself, her nails clawing her skin, whispering apologies to the corpses she had never meant to summon. I sat across from her, rifle across my lap, and simply breathed. Slow, steady, deliberate. She stared at me through strands of dark hair and asked why I hadn't abandoned her like the others. I told her that silence doesn't abandon, it endures, and maybe, just maybe, I could teach her to endure too. The days that followed became tests of survival. Every time she woke from nightmares, her screams tore through the dawn, rattling bones into hateful life. But when I was there, steady as stone, her curse faltered. I realized then it wasn't my silence alone. It was the rhythm of my voice. When I spoke softly, calmly, that lulled the corpses back to rest. It was as if her power was bound to sound itself, and only my voice, measured and unwavering, could anchor her storms. Together we learned to weave quiet into the chaos, turning nights of terror into uneasy calm. But unease, I knew, could not last forever. One evening, as the crimson sun bled into the horizon, Solara confessed what had truly cursed her. Her people had tried to turn her into a weapon, using her voice to awaken fallen armies against their rivals. But when she could not control the tide, when the dead turned against her own kin, they branded her an abomination and cast her into the wild. Her scars were deeper than her skin. They were etched into her spirit, carved by betrayal. She told me she wanted me to leave before the same fate swallowed me. I laughed softly, shaking my head, and told her she would never scare me away. Her lips trembled with something I hadn't seen before. Hope. Hope, however, is fragile in a world of bones. Weeks into our uneasy alliance, the necrotic hordes began to grow restless, stirring even without her voice. It was as though something deeper in the soil had awoken, something older than Solara's curse. She begged me to run, but I knew leaving her meant condemning her to isolation, and isolation would destroy her faster than the dead ever could. So we stayed together, hunting food among carcass-strewn ruins, learning which tombs to avoid, which valleys swallowed screams. And every night, when silence failed and her curse rose, I would speak into the chaos, a tether pulling her back from the edge. It was during one of those nights that I discovered her scream wasn't just destruction, it was music. Beneath the terror, her voice carried a rhythm, a resonance that echoed in bones, not just to raise them, but to command them. She had never realized it, blinded by her fear. But I heard it clearly. The difference between cries of anguish and cries of intent. And if she could learn control, she wouldn't just summon corpses, she could turn them. The thought chilled me. But it also planted a seed. What if her curse could become our salvation? Solara resisted the idea, swearing she'd never weaponize her voice again. But survival has its own demands. One night, when hundreds of corpses closed in, we had no choice. I whispered to her, telling her to trust me, to release her scream not in fear but with purpose. The ground split, the air trembled, and the horde rose, but this time they froze mid-motion, their hollow sockets fixed on her. My voice cut through hers, steady and firm, anchoring her storm into coherence. The corpses fell to their knees, awaiting command. For the first time in her life, Solara saw her power obey, and for the first time, I feared her as much as I loved her. But power attracts predators. The necromancers who had once abandoned Solara began to stir when they felt the dead no longer answered only to them. They sent hunters, twisted creatures, bound by soul chains, to track her down. We fought them in ruins and caverns, fire and silence our weapons. Yet no matter how many fell, more came, drawn to her voice like moths to flame. Each battle tested us, carving us into something harder, something sharper. She became less the cursed girl who trembled at her own breath, and more a queen of screams, while I became her balance, the silence that kept her from drowning in her own echoes. Still, the more she leaned on me, the more I wondered, was I saving her, or was I damning us both to a war we could never win? I carried the weight of every corpse we left behind, every soul forced back into motion by her cries. She carried it too, though she masked it beneath her growing strength. There were nights I woke to find her staring at her hands, whispering, prayers to gods that never answered. On those nights, I would take her hand, press it against my chest, and remind her of the one thing she could not deny, that she was not alone. Our bond deepened in ways neither of us spoke aloud. In every battle, she screamed to awaken, and I spoke to silence, our voices weaving into a pattern older than war itself. We became melody and counterpoint, chaos and calm, destruction and salvation. Yet the closer we grew, the more the necromancers hunted us, their fury swelling as they realized Solara was no longer their forsaken tool, but their greatest rival. And with every step deeper into this conflict, I knew one truth with cruel clarity. We could not keep running forever. It was Solara who made the choice. One night, as we sheltered in a ruin lit only by starlight, she told me she would not hide anymore. She wanted to confront the necromancers, to tear apart the chains they used to bind the dead. I told her it would kill us both. She smiled faintly and said maybe that was fate. But then she looked at me with fire in her eyes and whispered that if fate had chained her, then maybe my silence could break it. That was the moment I realized our story was no longer about survival. It was about rewriting destiny itself. From that night forward, we walked not as fugitives, but as warriors. She trained her voice, learning to turn shrieks of terror into tones of command, weaving her resonance into shapes of precision. I honed my words, learning how to time my voice to her notes, cutting through chaos like a blade. Together we became something the necromancers had never imagined, harmony born of contradiction. Her screams awakened the corpses, but my voice was the silence that saved us. And in that paradox, we forged a new kind of weapon. But weapons are only as strong as their will, and will is tested in fire. Our fire came in the form of an army, thousands of corpses marching under necromancer banners, driven not by hunger but by order. They moved with unity, a grotesque parody of life, their hollow sockets glowing with green fire. At their head stood the necromancers themselves, their bodies draped in chains that rattled with the weight of stolen souls. Solara stood tall beside me, her throat trembling with unspent power, her eyes brimming with both fear and resolve. She was no longer the girl who wept at her own scream. She was the storm, and I was her anchor. Solara hated it. She wanted no throne, no title. She wanted only freedom from the chains that had bound her since birth. Yet freedom is rarely free. With every corpse that rose at her scream, with every pale choir that fell to her defiance, her legend grew. She asked me if she would ever just be Solara, just a girl. I told her the truth. She would never be just anything. She would be more, always more. But being more didn't mean being alone. And as long as I breathed, she would have me, her anchor in the tide. We reached the blackened heart of the northern wastes after weeks of pursuit. There, the ground pulsed with whispers, the very air alive with resonance. Bones shifted of their own accord, crawling across the ground like insects, forming into shapes only to collapse again. Solara clutched my hand so tightly her nails drew. Blood, but I didn't flinch. Together we stepped into the center of that storm, where the ground fell away into a vast chasm. From below rose a sound unlike anything we had ever heard, a chorus of screams, layered into a single endless note. Solara's eyes widened. She whispered that it was calling her name. The chasm became our crucible. The pale choir returned in numbers beyond count, their bodies fused with bone and shadow, their voices weaving against Solara's. She screamed, I spoke, and between us the battlefield trembled. Corpses rose and fell, mountains cracked, the sky itself shook with the weight of voices colliding. But even as we fought, I knew this was not the true enemy. The enemy waited below, listening, waiting for Solara to surrender, to let her scream merge with its eternal chorus. I whispered into her ear as we fought, reminding her of who she was, of the girl I had met in ruins. She nodded, tears mixing with sweat, and screamed not for the dead but for the living. That scream changed everything. Instead of raising the corpses, it shattered them into dust. The pale choir faltered, their bone armor crumbling, their whispers breaking apart. For the first time, Solara's voice was not just a call to the dead, it was defiance against death itself. The chasm shook violently, and the endless chorus below grew angrier, louder, filling the air with madness. Solara fell to her knees, clutching her throat, her body trembling with the weight of what she had unleashed. I held her close, whispering into her ear, my silence steady as stone, anchoring her storm. And in that moment, we both knew the true. War had only just begun. The chasm's roar never ceased. It sang with voices stolen from centuries of the dead, weaving them into a single endless hymn that made even mountains quake. Solara knelt at its edge, her face pale, her throat raw. I could see it in her trembling frame. The chorus wanted her scream to join its eternity. She clutched at her chest, her breaths ragged, whispering that the voices felt like home, that they promised an end to her suffering. I gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet my eyes. Home is not made of bones, I told her. Home is built where someone stays with you. The pale choir surged again, their forms more grotesque than before, as if the chasm itself spat them into being. Their bone-stitched armor now fused with molten shadows, their hollow sockets burning with endless hunger. They didn't advance like soldiers, but like waves, a tide of horror that drowned the valley. Solara's scream rose against them, shaking the sky itself. But this time her voice did not command. It resisted. Her scream tore into the choir, splintering them into fragments that howled as they died. Yet each time one fell, the chasm birthed two more. We were not facing an army. We were facing infinity. The ground cracked beneath us, pillars of bone erupting skyward, forming bridges and towers like a cathedral of death. From its heart rose the mother voice, not a figure, but a storm, a swirling vortex of sound and shadow, stitched together by the countless screams of those it had consumed. Its presence bent reality, making every bone in my body ache, every breath feel stolen. Solara gasped, her scream rising unbidden, resonating in harmony with the mother voice. I shouted, calling her back, but my words were swallowed by the storm. I realized then that silence alone would not be enough. I had to make my voice matter. I gripped her hand and spoke louder, my words steady and fierce, carving through the cacophony. I spoke of her strength, of the girl I had first met, trembling, but unbroken, of the woman she had become, fierce, powerful, defiant. For a moment, her eyes flicked toward me, tears cutting through the ash on her face. Her scream faltered, breaking the harmony, and the mother voice shrieked in fury, its storm turning wild. The pale choir collapsed, clutching at their skulls, as if shattered by their own master. I pulled her against me, whispering not silence now, but love. Words I had never dared speak before became our weapon. Solara clung to me as the storm shrieked, but the pull of the mother voice was relentless. She confessed through trembling lips that part of her wanted to surrender, that being part of the chorus meant no more loneliness, no more chains, no more fear of hurting anyone. I held her tighter, my forehead against hers, and told her the truth. You are not a weapon. You are not a curse. You are Solara, and as long as I breathe, you will never be alone again. Her scream tore free once more, but this time it was not in despair. It was a scream of defiance, and it shattered the bones of the earth. The chasm split wide, revealing an abyss filled with writhing forms, billions of corpses singing in unison. The mother voice howled, its fury rattling the stars above. Solara rose to her feet, her body trembling with power, her silver hair whipping in the storm. She looked at me once, her eyes glowing like molten suns, and whispered, "Anchor me." I nodded. She screamed, and the sky itself cracked open. Her voice collided with the mother voice in a duel that shook creation itself. A battle of sound and silence, life and death. My voice wrapped hers, steady and unwavering, guiding her through the storm. The pale choir shattered into dust, their screams stolen, their bodies crumbling into nothing. The corpses below writhed, then fell still, their eternal song silenced. The mother voice shrieked as cracks tore through its storm, fragments of light breaking free. Solara screamed one final time, pouring everything into that cry, not as a curse, but as a choice. Her scream became light, radiant and pure, unraveling the storm. The chasm erupted in silence so absolute it felt like the universe itself held its breath. When it cleared, the mother voice was gone. Only echoes of dust, and silence remained, and Solara collapsed into my arms. We lay there for hours, the world eerily quiet around us. For the first time since I had met her, There were no corpses rising, no whispers in the air. Solara's chest rose and fell against mine, her breath shallow but steady. When her eyes finally opened, she whispered hoarsely, "It's gone." I stroked her hair, smiling with a relief so fierce it ached. "No," I told her softly. "You're still here, and that's all that matters." She smiled faintly, her lips trembling, and for the first time, her silence was not born of fear, but of peace. We returned to the valley weeks later, walking through ruins that had once teemed with corpses. Now only dust remained, scattered, like forgotten prayers. Solara looked around with quiet awe, her hand slipping into mine. "It's strange," she murmured, "to live in a world where the dead stay dead." I squeezed her hand, my voice calm. "That's because it's time for the living to rise." She laughed softly, the sound fragile but beautiful, and it echoed not like a scream, but like hope. It was the first time I had ever heard her laugh, and it felt like victory greater than any battle. In time, others found us, villagers, outcasts, survivors who had once feared her name. They approached with caution, expecting death in her voice. But when Solara opened her mouth, no corpses stirred. She spoke instead, her voice gentle, trembling, but alive. The people wept, falling to their knees, not in fear but in reverence. They called her the Dawn Voice, the one who ended the chorus. Solara leaned against me, whispering that she did not want to be anyone's savior. I told her she didn't have to be. She only had to be herself. And that was enough. The legends would grow, as they always do. They would tell stories of the cursed girl whose scream shattered death and of the man whose voice anchored her to life. They would exaggerate our battles, twist our journey, turn us into myths, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth that only she and I knew, that she had been more than her curse, and that I had been more than her silence. Together, we had become something greater. Together, we had broken the chorus of death itself, and in that silence, we had found life.